Thank you, Jeff. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us tonight to celebrate the launch of Tas's new book, the Storytelling Workbook, a 9-week program to tell your story. So I am, Martin Liu of Lid Publishing, and of course we are the fortunate publisher of Tas's book. First of all, thank you, Jessica, for your welcome and your hospitality. We always appreciate the support that you and your colleagues give us at Homegrown, so thank you so much. So tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to put, Tas under the spotlight and ask him a few questions about him, his work, and of course about storytelling. And then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for some questions from the audience. So, before I interrogate Tas, let me just introduce him to everybody here. So, I have worked with Tas now for about 8 years as his publisher, and we have published together 4 books now, which I think is incredibly productive and remarkable. I think of all the authors that we work with, I genuinely would say that Tas is one of our most original thinkers.
But you said that to all the authors.
No, I don't actually, no. But also in terms of his writing, again, I genuinely believe that he is one of the most talented that we have published over the past 10 years. Although, of course, none of this should be a surprise to most of you who know Tas. I mean, he's essentially a modern man of many talents and guises. He runs his own training company with clients from all over the world. He's also a serious educator associated with the Chartered Institute of Marketing, the Market Research Society, the Institute of Internal Communication, and also the Civil Service College, as well as being a lecturer at Nottingham Trent University and is it Buxnew University? Buxnew University. I mean, these are institutions where Tas runs and, of course, teaches courses on storytelling, behavioural economics, insight, and creative briefing. Tas's professional background is in advertising as a planner, and even today he still works on various agencies and projects that are specific as a planner. And he also gets up at a ridiculously early hour to appear on Talk Radio's early breakfast show with James Max talking about things relating to marketing.
And this Saturday morning, if anyone's up at 6, just to warn you.
I'm really honest, I've never heard Tas this on the radio because it's just far too early for me. So welcome, Tas. And again, first of all, congratulations on the publication of your new book, The Storytelling Workbook. So perhaps we could begin by you telling us something more about yourself, especially in relation to how you became so interested in storytelling.
There are going to be a few stories that some of you have probably heard 100 times, so can I apologise already? How quickly does it take me to talk about Latin and Greek? Should I do that? I'll do that then. I mean, there are a couple of people here, including Richard over there, who I worked in advertising with 30 years ago, something like that. So I started off working in ad agencies and fell into it really by accident, which is a lot of, I think, an explanation for things like insight and serendipity. So I didn't really think I'd work in advertising, but fell into it and quite enjoyed it. But got really disappointed and depressed about how badly people presented, how awful PowerPoint was, and how incredibly bad an awful lot of brand communication was. And having started, before I went into advertising, having started as a classicist, I kept thinking about all these great stories that I read about, whether it was Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, wherever it was. And think these are great stories and they excite people and they get people emotionally involved. And also, having studied a bit of sort of Roman and Greek history, you learn about rhetoric and persuasion, how the great leaders would try and persuade their people to do things. And I thought all these were quite interesting skills, but no one in the advertising business or the marketing business seemed to bother with that. It was all about, let's just bore people rigid with lots of facts. Let's put loads of presentations together. And we created what I think I called in one of the books, a generation of deckheads. Okay. So part of my mission was to say, can we bring some of that excitement and emotion and joy of storytelling and bring it into business and bring it into marketing and bring it into internal communications as a way of just making it more interesting and more effective.
I mean, in terms of today's, I mean, if you're, talking to a younger audience, I mean, how would you persuade them that, storytelling is actually an effective and useful tool?
I think it's one of those strange things, but often you see people who are training people about things that people don't know about. But I'm talking to people about things that everyone knows about storytelling, because we grow up reading stories. As children, we hear stories, we understand the world through stories. As parents, we talk to our children, we again instruct them, educate them, help them understand the world through stories. So for me, it's all I'm saying is they've always been there. So I see myself as trying to restore, if you like, the lost art of storytelling. To say, we all know how stories work. We're all watching, I hope we're all watching, Stranger Things, or other TV programs are available. Or Severance, I'm going to say Severance. Please ask me later about Severance if you haven't watched it. But whatever it is, or we read great books, or the fact is we are still immersed in storytelling. But for some reason it was considered to be adrift from how marketing and communications work. Now for young people in particular, we'll talk about social media, I'm sure. Everyone says, well, it's different, it's a digital world and everything is. But the principles of communication for me are the same. You have to attract people, you have to play on their emotions, you have to inspire different feelings, and you have to create ways in which people remember what you're saying. And for me, all of those things come under the heading of storytelling, and therefore they fit pretty much any channel or medium that you want.
Yeah. I mean, you wrote this book, the Storytelling book, 7 years ago. It was published some 7 years ago. And, this book still continues to sell, incredibly well year after year. I mean, perhaps you could just tell us why you decided to write your new book, the Storytelling Workbook, and what do you hope to, I guess, provide people, with the new book?
I think a number of reasons. One is I think my work is still not done. Does that sound ironic? It was meant to be ironic. So there's that. And also I just love, as you know, Martin, I love the process of writing, frankly, so again, apologies to my family. I'll keep writing. But the second thing is, and it goes back to, I suppose, your previous question, things have changed. So one of the things I wanted to do, because the first book was really about sort of three elements. One was where we're going wrong, which is this obsession with numbers, what I call arithmocracy, the obsession with numbers and measurement and KPIs. Anyone who works in marketing or business, you'll know what I mean. KPIs and metrics, everyone's become obsessed with them. So I wanted to sort of just take a look back and say, why has that happened and can we stop doing that, please? Then the second part was why storytelling works. And then the rest of it was sort of tips and tricks. So I thought I'd done a sort of certain amount on that. And then I got more comments from people, I've done more training over those sorts of years. But also I thought it was nice to sort of, put some exercises. So actually the book is interactive. So they are, in the sense that there are exercises after each week and you can do these things. But the second thing is we thought it was a good idea to specifically look at different areas in which we can apply it. So not just you've got a presentation to write, but also if you're doing your CV. So again, looking at different target audiences, I work in marketing and advertising, always think about target audiences. So looking at people who are looking at getting jobs or changing jobs, how you apply that to CVs. Because there's a section in the new book where I anonymise them to spare their embarrassment. But there are things that people write on LinkedIn which are just painfully dull. Sorry, clearly no one here, obviously. But they're very generic and they're very dull. And so part of what I'm saying is, okay, that's another area where you can apply storytelling, is how do you tell your story in your CV, in your LinkedIn profile, and also, kids, in your dating app. So if I say Tinder, is that a generic, can I do, I don't know what but there's a specific thing after each exercise. How would you apply this if you're trying to sell yourself, if you're trying to meet someone, if you're trying to tell your own story? So that was another way in which I thought we could sort of just bring it, not exactly up to date, but just put a new spin on it, new gloss on it.
I mean, it seems like anyone can tell a story, but I mean, what makes a good story in your mind? I mean, what are the characteristics that we should be looking for, to make a story effective?
There's a number of things, obviously, in the book about that. But one of the things that I always say is, if you look at, again, some of you will know that I used to help run a cinema in North London called the Phoenix, the oldest continuing running cinema in the UK. And one of the things that I thought was interesting about the pandemic, one of the obviously depressing things about the pandemic was because we couldn't go to the cinema, we couldn't go to the theatre, we couldn't go to gigs, there were certain things that we just missed out on. And it's sharing emotions. So you go to see a film, you go and laugh at a rom-com, you go and laugh at Yesterday, Richard Curtis film, or you go and jump, scare at a moment of fear, or you go and cry, sad moment. There's no alternative, there's nothing like sharing that experience. So for me, story is about inspiring and amplifying emotions socially. So again, even when you're doing a PowerPoint presentation, and I say it in the book and I do it in my training, so don't just think about what you're telling people, think about how you want them to feel. And a story is a great way of guiding those sorts of feelings and guiding those sorts of emotions. Because another thing that I talk a lot about, and again, apologies for some of you know, is behavioural economics, which is one of my other areas, which is the idea that humans are far more influenced by their emotions and unconscious and social factors than we like to admit. And again, that's what story is. Story is all about bringing emotions to life, and it's all about one other word, which is having a bit of a moment, which is empathy. So whatever you're trying to do, again, if you're trying to tell people who you are, what you're like on your CV, or trying to attract people on your dating app, the same thing applies. You want people to empathise with you. And again, so much communication isn't about empathy, it's about hectoring. It's about, I've got some charts and you're going to listen. So that's also for me the power of stories, to create that sense of empathy and emotion.
I mean, for me, in the book, there are, I suppose, two standout ideas. The first one...
Two?
Two major ones for me. The first one is getting past the attention spam, and the second idea is weaving the golden thread. I mean, perhaps you could just explain the two to the audience and their importance to storytelling. I mean, perhaps the first one, the attention spam idea.
Yeah, that's, as I mentioned before, in the next book, probably the last book, I think, well, I don't know, last until the next one, is about insight. And I've written about insight before. And for me, insight is, as I say, about serendipity. And it's about allowing your brain to make unconscious connections, because that's the definition of insight. So I often say information is to be collected, but insight is to be connected. You're welcome. So this was an accident. I was typing something a few years ago, and I don't know if anyone's got keyboards. If not, it doesn't matter. If you look at a keyboard, the letters N and M are next to each other on the keyboard. And I accidentally typed, I was writing attention span, obviously, but I accidentally typed attention spam. And I thought, I quite like that. So that's become my sort of go-to expression now for saying, whatever you're communicating, again, whether it's a presentation, whether it's a pitch, whether it's a piece of brand communication, whether it's internal comms, whether it's your Tinder profile, whatever, the first thing you have to get through is attention spam. Because the way that the brain works, 90% of stuff that we hear, we take in, doesn't get recalled. It gets left in the unconscious to be left in abeyance. So we think that everything we say, and again, it doesn't matter whether you're presenting or whether you're trying to talk to somebody, have a conversation with your children or your wife, your partner, whatever. We like to think that everything goes from our attention inbox into your attention inbox. But that's just not how the brain works. So I use this expression attention spam as a sort of guide to say to people, whatever you're creating, the first thing you have to understand is, how do I get through attention spam? And as I say, it doesn't matter what channel, what medium you're using. The first thing you have to say, just because you think it's inherently interesting doesn't mean that they do. And then the golden thread, which is the reason why the books are gold, why is the needle and thread on the front? Beautifully coordinated. I just love that as a metaphor and an analogy. And again, apologies for those of you who have heard the Theseus and the Minotaur story. But again, it was the classical story of Theseus of Athens, so King Minos of Crete. I'm sure you're all familiar with this story. King Minos of Crete defeated the Athenians in battle and said, as a result, you will send me 7 young men and 7 young women to Crete. There they will be taken to the centre of the labyrinth, the fiendish maze devised by Daedalus, the father of Icarus, flew too near the sun. And in the centre of the labyrinth is my son, the Minotaur, half man, half bull. And he will tear them limb from limb. Upbeat story. Until there arose, I have to say, a hero in Athens called Theseus, and Theseus travels to Crete, meets King Minos, but falls in love with King Minos' daughter, Ariadne,
And Ariadne falls in love with Theseus and says, Theseus, no one has ever got into the centre of the labyrinth. It's such a fiendish, complicated maze. And even if they did, they'd never be able to slay the Minotaur. And even if they had got in and they had slain the Minotaur, they'd never find their way out. So according to different versions, tellings of the story, she gives him a ball of thread, golden ball of thread, and he traces his way into the centre of the labyrinth and then slays, that's what it did in those days, slays the Minotaur, and then he traces his way back out. And I love that story, and I know it's quite a common used a lot in psychotherapy, for example, but for me it seemed a great analogy for creating an argument, creating a path. So again, Philip Pullman calls it the path through the woods. He says any writer, any novelist, the woods are the details, the facts, the character, or the backstory. But it's the novelist, the writer's, the author's job to guide the reader or the viewer on a path through the woods. So a lot of what I say is about too much of what we write, too much of what we say is just one damn fact after another. Somebody said about history is just one damn fact after another. So we very often do that. We just bludgeon people with facts and details and numbers, as I said earlier. So one of the things I just talk a lot about and work, there's an exercise in there and we work in training on it, is how do you create a thread? It might be an analogy, it might be an argument, it might be a sort of path of logic, but you need something that holds together, because otherwise the audience's brain literally loses the thread. So that's one of the key thoughts that I, try and talk about throughout the book.
Mm. I mean, obviously, storytelling is pretty well established in marketing and branding. Can you give us some examples of what you would consider to be, very good storytelling in those sectors?
I think there's an awful lot of brands that most people know. I mean, sorry, I talk about brands because, it's part of my background. But, I mean, brands like Apple are very good at it. Brands like Virgin are very good at it. Brands like Body Shop with Anita Roddick used to be very good at it. Because they not only told a story, because, again, I know there are a couple of people from Homegrown here, so entrepreneurs looking at, how they tell their own brand story. But a lot of it, and there's a whole section, again, in the book about it, is not just what people say, but how you say it. I think some of the really great sort of brand storytellers, as all stories actually are about, they're not just about what they say, but they are about how you say it. And one of the things that I do rant about, and again, many people will know, like a good rant, is that I think in marketing and communications generally, people spend way too much time thinking about content, which is what they say, and nowhere near enough time thinking about form, which is how they say it. So again, for me, one of the great things that really good brands and brand storytellers understand is the role of form and character and personality. So someone like Apple or Virgin or Innocent, or even the sort of British Library had a fantastic poster, which I talked about the other day in a training thing, which just has welcome. And it has welcome to about 20 different little niches. And it's beautifully written. And it's all about these individual groups and niches and people who come to the British Library. And the personality is just, it's really sweet. It understands how people love books and love libraries and congregate and throng around libraries. So again, that's another example of a brand that sort of tells that story, or tells a story really well, because it understands the personality. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, sorry, shameful admission here. Many years ago, a couple of you all know, I did used to work on KFC. So a sordid past, okay. And it was really tough because they had terrible advertising. They had an animated Colonel Sanders. I remember when I worked on it, and I think this was after CDP, one of the things we tried to do was we wanted to get rid of the Colonel because he was a horrible character and everyone hated him. So KFC for us stood for Kill the Colonel. But I don't know if you noticed, a couple of years ago they had a problem with their suppliers. They ran out of chicken. You remember that story? Like, there were whole swathes of young people wandering high streets like zombies because they couldn't get the chicken. But they did a brilliant ad. And I thought, God, why didn't they do that when I was around? And it just had a bucket. And it just said FCK. Okay? Which was their way of saying sorry. Okay? And it was just really right for that audience. Because it was a bit, okay, it's a bit cheeky, it's a bit whatever. But it was a really nice sort of way of understanding how the brand works, and understanding that sort of connection and tone of voice with the audience. So I think sometimes brands get, and also I think we do as people, often get obsessed with facts and information. But the softer things and the personality and the character are as important to storytelling as the content.
Also, I guess storytelling brings out the humour in a lot of people. That's
Yeah.
one of its advantages, I would think.
I mean, I think, again, if you look at sort of particularly sort of advertising, British advertising versus American advertising, well, I think American advertising is getting better. There is an enormous sort of swathe of British advertising going all the way back to, dare I say, people like agencies like CDP in the 70s, which was all about humour. And it was all about sort of wit and intelligence. And anyone who remembers ads like Silk Cut or Benson and Hedges, when they were sort of cigarette advertising, because they couldn't say anything, they had to use ways of subverting the rules. And they had some incredibly clever and witty and intelligent campaigns. And again, I think humour is one of those things that is all about empathy. So again, another brand that I think does this very well, and there's no one here from there, unfortunately. I used to work with them for a bit, which is Specsavers, right? Everyone knows Specsavers, right? Very, very famous brand. And I often, okay, I'll try this. If I ask you now, are your eyes important to you? Vision, yeah? That's sort of ironic, yeah. Vision, so vision is an important matter, right? Vision, yeah? So it's a serious matter. So how come Specsavers is all about comedy then? Because they realise it's not just about being dull and boring. So Vision Express tried to take on Specsavers by saying, we take vision seriously, which was a deliberate attempt to say, oh, don't go with those guys, they're jokers, whatever. But what Specsavers understands is that humour is empathy. And again, humour, story, empathy, insight, they're all linked for me. And again, that's what really good brands do, and that's what really good communication is about. And again, some brands and some clients and some people are a bit nervous about humour. But for me, it is just one of the ways that we connect as human beings. It's also, because I've written about humour in all the books, it's a bizarre topic, isn't it? Because it's something everyone understands and does, but even the scientists don't really understand how humour works or its evolutionary origins. No one really understands the science of humour. It's bizarre, but it is something that absolutely everyone understands. And for those of you who are from homegrown or interested in setting up your own companies or positioning your own companies, don't rule out humour. Don't think that only comedians or only sort of jokers use humour, because humour, as I say, is a royal road to empathy. So I always recommend, not for every client in every occasion, but always think about humour as a way of cutting through.
I mean, these days we're living in this kind of social media, digital age, where content is short and concise, and where I guess attention span is relatively low. I mean, how do you see the role of storytelling developing in this kind of context?
It's interesting. This comes up quite a lot, and again, I think it's one of those things where it's at both ends of the spectrum. So you've got people saying that on YouTube you have to get attention in 3 seconds, or maybe 6. I don't know, somewhere between 3 and 6 seconds. But then you've got enormously long books being written, and you've got people binging on 8, 9, 10 hours of TV. So clearly, it's not one or the other. And I think it's, again, just about the nature of the content. So again, working with some clients, what I try and say is, okay, it doesn't automatically mean that everything has to be so short and so immediate and so shocking that it has to work in 3 seconds. So there's some ads that I use examples which are like 60, 90-second ads. And whenever I show them to people, I always say, yes, they are quite long, but people really get into them in the same way that they'll get into a TV program or a book that they're enjoying. So I don't think it's automatically the case that everything has to be shorter and sharper and more shocking. Alliteration there. But I do think that it's about finding the right things in the right channels.
Yeah. I mean, just moving on to more, practical matters. So, I mean, can you give us, your top 3 tips for anyone wanting to improve their storytelling skills and techniques? I mean, what are the 3 things that you yourself would put front of mind, when you're crafting or telling a story?
One of them is just what you just said, which is the rule of 3. So again, as a rule, never try and say more than 3 things. Never have more than 3 things on a slide. Never expect anyone to remember what you're going to say more than 3 things, because it's just, again, the capacity of the brain. So we know 3's everywhere. So 3 blind mice, 3 wise men, veni vidi vici, liberté, égalité, fraternité, the number of times you're a lady. So 3's are everywhere. So again, respect the rule of 3, because beyond 3, people aren't listening and don't care. So that's one. I've talked about the golden threads. I would have to say that again, I think, as well. One of the others, I think, is how you start. So again, whether you're talking about beginning a talk, whether it's the first slide in a presentation, whether it's your homepage, if you're setting your company up and you want people to come and land on your homepage and stay there, again, we just underestimate the extent to which first impressions count. They are disproportionately important. So again, I'm referring to the book to a literary theorist who talks about having an attack sentence. So how you start. And again, I use examples in the book and elsewhere about great novels and great books that start. So, it was the day my grandmother exploded. Anyone know that one? It is. It's, yeah. Yeah. Sorry? No, it's another Scottish author whose name I've now forgotten. This guy who did The Wasp Factory, Ian
Banks.
Ian Banks. Ian Banks. Yeah. And it's the beginning. It's not The Wasp Factory. It's Cruel Road. The Cruel Road. That's it. And that's the first line of the book. And I use that as an example, which sadly now I obviously can't remember. And I use that and other examples like, he woke up one morning and found himself transformed into a giant cockroach. These are, I mean, they're exceptional, but they are a sentence that just holds you, stops you, and makes you want to read on. And again, those are famous examples, but my point is, whatever you're doing, in whatever medium, you need to create that sort of sense of arresting people, stopping them in their tracks. And again, whether it's, as I say, the first line on your LinkedIn profile, whether it's the first thing you say on your dating app, or whether it's the first chart, it's amazing how people just don't do that. And yet we know it's true. Again, if you think about your favourite TV programme or... one other thing as well, which is I say about order. So there's a quote, and I will remember this, from Jean-Luc Godard. Any French film fans in tonight? None again. Jean-Luc Godard, famous French film director from the Nouvelle Vague, he said, a film should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, but not necessarily in that order. And again, I always say to people, don't start at the beginning. Whatever you're doing, never start it, because beginnings are a bit boring, especially if you're saying, hello, this is my, So start with something in the middle, or start at the end and then explain how you got there. So Andrew Stanton, who's the guy that does a lot of the Pixar films, he talks about this a lot. He says, in a story, you say 2 and 2, but you don't give people 4. You have to let people take part in the story. You have to let them be part of it to solve a puzzle. And again, one of the other tips that I talk about in the book, really good stories, not all stories, obviously, but many good stories are mysteries. And there's nothing we all love than a great story, a great mystery, a great whodunit. Have I got time for another classical reference? Yeah. Thank you. Who said that? Thank you, correct. Is the correct answer. Always the correct answer. So, I mean, Oedipus, right? So I bought, Oedipus Rex, probably the world's first detective story. And Oedipus did it himself. Sorry, spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't read it. But again, we love that. We love Sudoku. We love, because it just plays to a sense of solving mysteries and puzzles. So every generation, every era has its own Sudoku or crosswords. But the idea that we can set a story or a puzzle or a mystery is something that absolutely is a great way of doing all the things that I've talked about. It doesn't have to be all the time, but rather than tell people things like declaratively, set a question or set a mystery, because then people want to get involved and find an answer. And that's also, I think, quite an interesting way of just getting that storytelling sort of instinct going.
That's really good advice, Klaus. So you've written 3 other books. Obviously, the first one was the Storytelling book, and then that was followed by the Inspiratorium, and then was it 2 years ago?
It was 2 years ago.
2 years ago,
The book came out when people couldn't.
No, in citations. Could you please give our audience a quick abstract of each of the books, which we have here tonight for everybody?
I think I've talked about the first one and the fourth one. The second one is about insight and inspiration, which again is really one of my other areas. And I'm following that up, as I say, hopefully with book 5. Promise it's coming soon, Martin. So it's really about insight and inspiration, because again, working in marketing and brands and stuff, insight is one of those things that's become the golden, the golden thread. It's become sort of the holy grail. We must find insight because it will transform our brand. I know a couple of people who work in market research here, he says, pausing. And a lot of research people, so I'm just going to be rude back to market researchers. Sorry, David. Often market researchers think that if you stare long and longingly enough at data, you'll get insight. Which is the correct response, yeah. It doesn't, because insight is much more creative than that. So it was really me saying, how does insight, if you look at creative people, look at artists and scientists, they talk about insight and they don't talk about it in the way that market research people do. And market researchers decided that they now own insight, which again, I think is a little bit improper of them. So for me, it's insight. The Inspiratorium was about saying, okay, what are the creative, I suppose, streams that lead you toward insight? So again, it's about the unconscious. It's about being an outsider. It's about using error, because again, etymology, a bit of etymology. So in Latin, errare, from which we get error, doesn't mean a mistake. It means to wander. So an error isn't a mistake. It's just wandering. So again, if you want to get insight, you have to wander. You will make mistakes. You will fall off the tightrope. But that is the best way of generating insights. That was me really ranting about how insight was being misunderstood, I think. And then incitation was really, again, on the theme of insight, but looking at slogans and ideas and sayings and how we can look at them and, again, just derive new ways of thinking about what we're doing through some of these sayings and expressions. And again, some of them were very old, some of them were very new. So I think one of them was, I will put an Abbott Mead ad in here, Richard, for you, was the famous Economist campaign, which was one of the most famous poster campaigns. Everyone learns about it and is taught about it. And some of them are very famous, but the one I really liked, because it does play back to what you said before, Martin, notice the golden thread here, which is about attention span. So there's a fantastic, my favourite ever Economist poster, and probably my favourite ever poster ever, is, and I'll try and get all the words exactly right, and again, apologies to my family because they've heard this. Can you keep people interested, or are they, oh, look, a pigeon? And I love that, because I think it's not just about The Economist, it's about the whole nature of communication. It's about saying, this is what rather than saying, which is what the strategy was, The Economist is for people who are interesting, and it will make you, not boring if you're having conversations. But to do it in that way, for me, is not just about selling The Economist, it's actually about understanding how communication works. And for me, that is just such a beautiful piece. It's a really nice bit of insight, and it's so elegantly expressed. So again, for me, all those sort of themes, I suppose, hang around the same ideas.
And then finally, obviously we're just coming out of the pandemic. I think we've all gone through a bit of a reset. What are your plans in the short term? Are there any interesting projects, that you're working on that we should be looking out for?
There is a book 5, which is going to be on insight, another look at insight again. I'm trying to, as a couple of you know, I'm trying to write something that is fiction, but I'm not quite sure where I am with that, and it's still stuck in the equivalent of a drawer. Sorry, it's just because I know it's more time. But I am trying to do that as well. But at the moment, I'm just enjoying doing a combination of training and writing and talking and these sorts of things. And one thing, I do want to say one thing as well. I know we had a bit of a love-in at the beginning as well, but Martin talked about my writing and working with Lyd, because again, apologies, a couple of you have heard this at least anyway, which is when I decided I wanted to try and write the first book, I was very excited. I know a couple of other people, John's written a book as well, but you get very excited because it's I don't know, it's just a really personal thing. You've got all this stuff and you want to... And I sent it to a few publishers, and it was really demoralising. Really demoralising. They all said the same thing, which was, this is too interesting. Actually, I've literally got an email from someone saying, this is way too interesting for our readers. And they sent back the chapter that I wrote. I know, you say, Rob. They sent it back, and they literally wrote that, took 90% of it out, and left in about 3 nouns. And that was really disappointing. And then others said, oh, your style isn't appropriate for our audience. But Martin was about the only person who said, actually, no, we quite like that. This is all right. We don't mind that. So, again, I just, if anyone is interested in writing a book and, needs a publisher. But again, it goes back to this thing about style, content and style, which is, I think a lot of those publishers, and I've read a lot of books, clearly not lib books, but a lot of other marketing books or business books. And I find them incredibly dull, so I sound arrogant, and I want to say people should be allowed to write in their own style and with their own character and with their own personality, because as I said, that is what story is about. And I do wish sometimes that publishers would be a little bit more open-minded, or maybe the writers need to just find their sort of tone of voice a bit more as well. So I do want to write something else after this. As you know, one of the books, I think it's the only book you said no to, I think, was I do still want to try and write a spoof business book.
It's too interesting.
Which might be too interesting. Which will be called something like the 15 steps on the way to the peak of your success or something like that. But again, I think you might have pointed out that maybe people wouldn't know it was a spoof, which might be a problem. But if I can do that, I'll be happy. But let's see how the next few months go.
Thank you, Tas. I mean, I think we've sort of just stopped at the perfect time.